They gave me a medal at the end of it, a round piece of stamped alloy on a ribbon the color of old blood, pressed into my palm by a colonel who hadn't slept in 4 days and wasn't pretending otherwise. He shook my hand, said something about valor and the preservation of the colonial perimeter, and then walked away to do the same thing for 3 other men who were still breathing. I looked at the medal for a long time. Then I put it in my breast pocket and didn't take it out again for 6 months. I'm not saying I didn't earn it. I'm saying that earning it cost more than a piece of stamped alloy was worth, and that nobody in the chain of command was required to understand that. That's not a complaint. That's just a fact about how things work out here on the fringe. The people who give the medals can't fully know what went into the earning. If they did, they wouldn't have the stomach for the giving. That's a transaction that benefits from a certain careful distance between the 2 parties, and I've made my peace with that. My name is James Rourke. I was a frontier scout and wilderness tracker attached to the Wazuli Perimeter Survey, stationed at Firebase Tamba in the deep jungle of Sector 7. I'd been on that world long enough to know which plants would kill you and which ones would merely make you wish you were dead. Long enough to know the calls the local fauna made at different hours and what silence meant when it replaced those calls. Long enough to trust my gut when it went quiet in a way that felt wrong, even before my mind had assembled the reason. 3 years in the field does that. It calibrates you to an environment in ways that are difficult to articulate precisely and impossible to replicate from a briefing document. Firebase Tamba was not a large installation. 41 permanent personnel, a survey wing, a medical unit, a supply depot that was perpetually understocked, and a communications array that worked reliably about 60% of the time. It sat at the edge of a river delta, where the jungle thinned enough to provide clear sight lines for about 200 meters in all directions, which the installation's original planners had considered a tactical advantage. They were not wrong about that. The sight lines were useful. What the sight lines could not compensate for was everything you couldn't see once you stepped back under the canopy. The base had been established to serve a specific function, monitoring the advance of the Wazuli territorial expansion across Sector 7, and maintaining the survey corridor that allowed the territorial authority to assess whether the expansion warranted a diplomatic response, a military response, or continued patient documentation. I want to be clear about what the Wazuli were, because I have read subsequent reports that characterize them in ways that feel shaped by outcome rather than observation. The Wazuli were an insectoid civilization, genuinely alien in their biology, their logic, and their relationship to territory. They experienced what humans would call property and sovereignty in ways that had no precise analog in human political systems. They did not invade in the way that word implies. They expanded. They metabolized territory. They encountered resistance and worked around it the way water works around stone, not with malice but with persistence, with the patient logic of a system that had been operating on geological timescales before humanity had developed writing. They were not evil. I want to be clear about that too. But they were coming, slowly and certainly, and their methods of preparing territory for absorption had effects that were catastrophic to anything already living in that territory. The animals that Andrews was experimenting on would have been of intense interest to the Wazuli's advance units, had they known about them. The biochemical approach to behavioral modification that Andrews was pursuing was something the Wazuli had been developing independently for a very long time. The fact that a human scientist had gotten there first, on a world in their expansion corridor, using methods they would have recognized immediately. That was one of the things that made the subsequent policy reviews so complicated, and one of the reasons I received a medal rather than a court-martial of my own. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The first thing I noticed was the crocodiles. Firebase Tamba sat at the edge of a river delta, and the delta was full of armored reptiles, thick-bodied ambush predators that had occupied that ecosystem for what the xenobiologists estimated to be about 400,000 years. They were not subtle animals. They lay on the banks and in the shallows, and they killed things that came within range, and they had been doing exactly that since long before any human being had set foot on this world. They did not charge armed soldiers. They did not leave the water to pursue things that moved away from them. They had survived 400,000 years by being extremely conservative in their threat assessments. 400,000 years of not dying is a significant argument in favor of caution, and these animals had absorbed that argument completely. Then one morning, Private Acham came to find me where I was checking the sensor net on the south perimeter, and he told me, in the careful voice of a man who has seen something strange and is measuring his words because he doesn't want to sound unhinged, that the crocodiles had behaved very oddly the previous night. He said 3 of them had charged the base fence line. Not a single animal following prey, 3, in sequence, drawn toward the fence lights, and the generator hummed like they were responding to a stimulus they couldn't ignore. One of them had made it 12 meters past the water line before the automated defense grid turned it back. He said the night watch had logged it as an anomaly and flagged it for review, but nobody had followed up because it was early in the shift rotation, and Sergeant Perry was dealing with a supply dispute, and everyone had assumed it was a fluke. I did not assume it was a fluke. I've spent enough time in wilderness environments, this world and others, to know what a behavioral anomaly looks like versus what an ecosystem disturbance looks like. A single animal acting outside its established parameters is an anomaly. 3 animals of the same species acting outside their established parameters in sequence is a pattern, and a pattern has a cause. And in a survey environment where you are ostensibly monitoring for exactly this kind of change, you do not let a cause go uninvestigated. I pulled the sensor logs for the previous 2 weeks. When you know what you're looking for, the pattern is obvious. It had been building slowly enough that no single shift caught it as a trend. Animals approaching the perimeter that had no business approaching it, lingering where they should have fled, responding to the base's lights and sounds with curiosity rather than avoidance. Not just the crocodiles. Monitoring records showed 2 territorial avian predators roosting closer to the base than their species' known range tolerance. A pack of ground runners that normally avoided human scent had been detected inside the outer sensor ring on 3 separate nights. A breeding pair of large herbivores had been standing at the fence line for 6 hours on a Tuesday, not attempting to breach it, not feeding, just standing there in the rain with what I can only describe as an unfocused attention that was itself deeply wrong. The jungle was coming toward us, slowly but definitely. I sent 6 tagged animals, 3 we'd caught near the perimeter, 3 from farther out, to the field lab unit attached to 2nd Battalion. Standard toxicology and behavioral analysis, the kind of thing that takes 2 weeks to process and gets filed in a report that 3 people read. I marked the sample's priority and wrote in the notes section that I believed we were looking at external behavioral modification, possibly chemical in origin. Then I went back to my duties and watched the perimeter and waited. I also, in the privacy of my own thinking, began forming theories. None of them pointed directly at Andrews. I didn't know Andrews existed yet. But I had a shape in my mind of what could cause this, and that shape had human hands attached to it, because of the kind of systematic biochemical manipulation that produces these results requires synthesis, and synthesis requires equipment, and equipment implies a facility, and a facility implies a person who built it. What I did not know then, what none of us knew, was that Dr. Andrews had already been in the jungle for 11 weeks. Andrews, I've been asked to describe him for the record, and I'll do my best to be fair. He was a scientist of the first order, genuinely brilliant in his field, which was xenochemistry. Specifically, the isolation and weaponization of biological compounds found in alien ecosystems. He had published papers that had changed how the territorial authority thought about non-human biochemistry. He had a mind that worked differently from most people's minds, that saw connections and leverage points and applications that ordinary observation missed entirely. He was the kind of man who could walk into a jungle and identify, within a few days, the 3 or 4 species whose biochemistry contained the most exploitable potential, and then develop a synthesis protocol in a field lab with limited equipment that would have taken most research teams 6 months in a properly resourced facility. These were all real things. He was genuinely gifted. The problem was that his ethics had not kept pace with his ambitions, and out here on the fringe, where oversight was thin and the jungle was thick, and accountability was a concept that got progressively more abstract the further you moved from the administrative center. That gap had grown into something that should have been prosecuted under 3 separate military statutes. He had been observed doing something that brilliant people with bad ethics tend to do, which is to substitute capability for permission. He could do this. He had the means. Therefore, the question of whether he should was no longer operational. He had established a laboratory in the deep jungle, approximately 9 kilometers from Firebase Tamba, in a canyon that the local tribal settlement, the Mahura, called the Canyon of the Man-Ape. He had not registered this facility with Survey Command. He had not reported his activities to the Perimeter Survey. He had not sought authorization from the Territorial Authority's Research Oversight Board. He had simply gone into the jungle with his equipment and his 6 contractors, and done what he wanted to do, in the confident expectation that the results would justify the process. What he was doing, capturing native fauna, injecting them with compounds of his own synthesis, and releasing them back into the ecosystem to observe the effects. What the effects were, specifically, was this. Any creature injected with his compound became responsive to a chemical signal he could produce artificially, a signal that functioned like a cross between a territorial aggression trigger and a fear response to prey. You could make an animal charge. You could make it ignore its own survival instincts. You could make it attack things it had no evolutionary reason to attack. At high enough concentrations, you could make it do this until it died, because the compound suppressed pain response and fatigue signaling to the point where the animal would simply continue until its body failed. He was building a weapon. He was testing it on the local wildlife because local wildlife was available and cheap and nobody was counting them. And the animals that had been approaching Firebase Tamba's perimeter had been approaching it because trace concentrations of his compound had dispersed into the river system and the prevailing wind patterns. Andrews hadn't accounted for that drift, or hadn't cared about it, which amounts to the same thing from where I was standing, and it was affecting every creature in a 30-square-kilometer radius to varying degrees. Insufficient concentration to trigger the full behavioral override, but enough to produce the disorientation and the anomalous approach behavior I'd been observing. I didn't learn any of this until later. What I learned first was the Man-Ape. The Mahura settlement was a 2-hour walk from Tamba, upriver and inland, through jungle that thinned enough near the canyon approaches to let you walk upright most of the way without fighting the canopy. The Mahura were the indigenous population of Sector 7, not human, but close enough in morphology and social organization that the Territorial Authority had designated them a protected cultural group under the colonial contact protocols, which in practice meant that survey personnel were supposed to notify command before any interaction that could be characterized as disruptive to their established social patterns. In practice, it meant we visited occasionally, we traded occasionally, and we kept each other roughly informed about what was happening in the territories we shared. It was a workable relationship. They understood what the base was and what it was not, and they had calibrated their engagement with us accordingly. Their elder, a man named Mahura, they had a custom of naming the current elder after the founding elder. I never asked about the theology behind it, but I respected it, had sent word to the base 2 days after I filed my sensor analysis. He wanted to see me specifically, not the base commander. This was noted. He said the canyon was wrong. He said it in their idiom, which translated roughly as the canyon has a new smell, meaning the background texture of the place had changed in a way that his people found threatening, but couldn't precisely articulate. I recognized what he was describing immediately, because it matched what I had been observing in the base perimeter data. Tamba came with me, as she always did. Tamba was what we called my chimpanzee, a highly intelligent animal that the previous scout assigned to this posting had trained over 3 years to assist with reconnaissance and perimeter monitoring. Chimps were used throughout the frontier survey system for exactly this. Their spatial awareness, their sensitivity to atmospheric chemical signals, and their ability to move through jungle terrain without producing the sound signature of a human soldier made them extraordinarily useful early warning systems. A trained chimpanzee moving through jungle produces about 1/8 the acoustic signature of a careful human. They can smell trace compounds at concentrations far below human detection thresholds. They respond to threat stimuli about 200 milliseconds faster than the fastest human reaction time, on average. Tamba had been working with humans long enough that she understood about 150 distinct commands, and had developed what I can only call preferences and opinions of her own. She had opinions about food. The settlement's elder had once offered her something fermented, and she had studied him for a long moment with an expression I can only describe as measured. And she had opinions about certain pieces of equipment, and she had opinions about people, some favorable and some not. More relevantly, she had opinions about territory. She did not like the canyon. She had told me this in her way: refusal to advance, repeated alarm contact gestures, the specific postural signal she used when she was indicating an environmental threat rather than approximate one. On a previous visit to the canyon, approaches 3 weeks before any of this began. I had logged it and moved on because I had not yet understood the context. I should have investigated harder then. That's on me. Mahura met me at the edge of his settlement's outer marker, and we sat together in the way his people greeted visitors, facing the same direction, not each other, both looking at the tree line, which is a gesture of solidarity I have always found more honest than facing each other and performing mutual attention. He told me that 2 of his hunters had been lost in the canyon in the past month. That was unusual but not unheard of. The canyon was rough terrain, and the local predators were substantial, and the Mahura's hunters were experienced but mortal. He told me that the canyon now produced sounds at night that his elders could not identify. That was more unusual, because the Mahura's elders had been cataloging the sounds of that canyon for generations. He told me that a young scout had returned from the canyon 3 days ago and had not spoken since, and that the settlement's healer had examined him and found no physical injury, but could not explain the state he was in. That last part is what made me stop thinking about the sensor logs and start thinking about the canyon in a different way. I asked Mahura if he would show me where the scout had been. He said he would not go there himself. He said it with the matter-of-fact firmness of a man who has lived his entire life in dangerous terrain and knows exactly where his lines are. Not fear in the way that fear makes people small. It was the opposite of that. It was the kind of precision that only comes from having survived long enough to develop genuine expertise. When a man who has spent 60 years in deep jungle tells you he will not go somewhere, you put your hand on your sidearm, and you think hard before you disagree with him. I went anyway. This is not heroism. This is the job. You don't get to maintain a survey post by routing around every area of significant interest, because the most experienced local guide declines to accompany you. You accept the information, you adjust your risk posture, and you go. The canyon was approximately 4 kilometers at its longest axis, the walls rising about 40 meters on either side, the floor threaded with dry watercourse channels and dense scrub. The acoustics were strange. Sound bounced off the walls in ways that made distance judgment unreliable, so that a footfall 30 meters away could sound like it was directly behind you, and a voice from somewhere below could arrive as if it were above. I knew this from previous survey entries and had compensated for it in my movement pattern. I was moving carefully, keeping Tamba close, using hand signals and reading her posture the way you read a compass, not for direction, but for reassurance that your orientation is correct. She stopped flat back, every muscle locked. I stopped with her. The smell hit me a second later. I have been asked to describe it and I will try, though sensory language always falls short of the thing itself. Ammonia sharp as the primary note, with something organic underneath it that was not quite rot and not quite the smell of an animal marking territory, but somewhere between the two, blended in a ratio that had no clean reference in my experience. Layered on top of that was something I had no name for, a chemical sharpness that wasn't quite anything I had encountered before, faintly sweet the way that some industrial solvents are faintly sweet, a wrongness that preceded comprehension. Your body knows certain smells before your brain does. This was one of those. I had my sidearm out. I was scanning the canyon wall above my position, slowly, because Tamba's alarm posture was indicating elevation rather than level ground. It came from above. 7 meters, I estimated later. The leap was approximately 7 meters from a ledge I had assessed as unoccupied, because nothing with that kind of mass could have been standing on a ledge that narrow without producing a sound I would have detected. I was wrong about both of those things. I had been wrong about what kind of mass was involved, and I had been wrong about what kind of noise it required to stay still. The man-ape. I will describe it because people who weren't there need to understand what we were dealing with, and because subsequent documentation was, in my opinion, inadequate to the reality of the thing. It was bipedal and broadly primate in its body plan, but the word primate carries associations that will mislead you if you let it. It stood somewhere between 2 and 2.5 meters at full height. Its bone structure was heavier than anything that size had a right to carry, the arms in particular, proportioned for a kind of leverage that the human body has no analog for, the kind of leverage that can strip a tree of branches or compress stone if applied with sufficient patience. The hands, I saw them up close more than once, and I will not forget them, had a grip geometry documented later by survey engineers as capable of approximately 800 kilograms of static force at full extension. The face was partially human and partially something older. Not ape, not human, but the kind of face that registers on a deep evolutionary level as occupying a category that your nervous system was not built to process calmly. There is a word for this in the xenopsychology literature, an uncanny adjacency to the familiar, and for once the academic language is doing some actual work. And it was not behaving like an animal. Animals act on instinct. They assess. They consider the cost-benefit of engagement against retreat, usually in milliseconds and below conscious processing, but the assessment happens. The behavior that comes out is, in a meaningful sense, optimal for that animal in that situation, given its evolved parameters. This thing did not do that. It landed between me and the canyon exit and it advanced, and there was nothing in its behavior that I can describe as threat assessment. It was doing something that I can only call intent. It had decided. It had decided before it jumped. Whatever the distinction between deciding and acting on pure instinct is, this was on the deciding side of the line, and that distinction matters enormously when you are trying to determine whether something can be deterred. I put 3 rounds into its left shoulder from 12 meters. Standard sidearm ammunition, the kind designed for use against medium-large fauna at close range. It absorbed them. Not without reaction, it slowed, and it turned toward me with what I can only describe as focused attention, the way a person turns toward an interruption. But it did not stop, and the slowing was temporary, and what came after the slowing was faster than what came before it. I got out of that canyon because Tamba did something I had never seen a trained chimpanzee do in a tactical situation, and that I had never specifically trained her to do, and that I am still, years later, not entirely sure how to categorize. She ran directly at the man-ape. Screaming, Not the alarm vocalization that indicates retreat and regroup, but a full-volume challenge call that primates use at the edges of territorial disputes, when they need to appear larger than they are. She ran directly at it, and she kept running directly at it until it turned its attention to her. And in the moment its attention shifted, I covered the distance to the canyon mouth and got behind the rock formation at the exit and turned back to cover her extraction. She came out 3 seconds later, fast and low, not using the watercourse channel but cutting straight across the scrub with a path optimization that I would have envied in a trained soldier. It came to the canyon mouth and stopped. It stood in the shadow of the canyon wall for a long time, looking out at us with that focused attention, and then it went back inside. I sat behind the rock formation and breathed. My hands were shaking. I noted this in a professional capacity, elevated adrenaline response, normal given the stimulus, not indicative of impaired function, and filed it away and kept breathing. Tamba climbed into my lap and put both hands on my face in the way she did when she was reassuring herself that I was intact. I let her do this for about 30 seconds, which is how long it took both of us to come back to baseline. Then I looked at the canyon mouth and I thought about what I'd seen, and I began to understand that the behavioral anomalies at the base perimeter and the thing in the canyon were the same problem from different angles. Mahura's settlement was where I found Andrew's man. He called himself Ramada, and he was not Mahura, he was human, or close enough to human that the distinction was academic, one of the fringe world mixed populations that don't fit neatly into any colonial registry, and whose papers are perpetually in some intermediate administrative state that nobody with authority has ever gotten around to resolving. He had been living in the settlement for 8 months, and he had married Mahura's daughter Shari, and he had been working for Andrews as a local guide and acquisition agent, trapping animals, navigating the canyon approaches, translating the geography for someone who didn't know the terrain, before he understood what Andrews was actually doing with what he brought him. He tried to tell me about Andrews in pieces, circling around it, because he was ashamed of his involvement and was managing both the shame and the tactical reality of the information simultaneously. He was also, I think, not yet certain he could trust me. I understood that. I have been in his position, the position of the person who knows things that will make them look bad, trying to determine whether the person they're confessing to is capable of distinguishing between culpability and complicity. I didn't push him. I let him come to it in the order that felt right to him, because I needed everything he knew and I needed it accurately. And accurate information from a reluctant source requires patience that the situation may seem to argue against. What he told me, assembled from the pieces he gave me over about 2 hours. Andrews had been in the deep jungle for almost 3 months. He had a facility in the lower canyon, built into a rock formation near the canyon's eastern approach, disguised well enough that aerial survey wouldn't have flagged it without specific tasking. He had 6 men with him, not scientists, not survey personnel, private contractors of the kind that appear on the fringe when someone is doing something that requires muscle and discretion, rather than expertise and authorization. He had been paying Ramada to bring him animals live, uninjured. Specific species from specific zones, and he had been releasing them after his procedures. Ramada had not asked what the procedures were until he saw one of the returned animals, a large territorial predator, ordinarily a solitary ambush hunter with well-documented threat avoidance behavior, standing in the settlement's outer ring at midday in plain sight, unmoving, staring at the settlement's water access point with an intensity that had no place in that animal's behavioral repertoire. And then it had charged a child. A Mahura child, 7 years old, who had been at the water point. The settlement's guards had killed the animal before it reached the child, but they had needed to kill it. It had not broken off. It had not responded to the noise and the movement that animals in a normal state respond to. It had come on until it was stopped permanently. Ramada had gone to Andrews and asked directly. Andrews had told him, with what Ramada described as cheerful precision, The precision of a man explaining something he considers elegant, that what he was developing was a compound that could, at sufficient concentration, make any complex organism with a functioning limbic system completely obedient to a single chemical command. Not suggestible, not influenced, obedient. The command would override survival instinct, pain response, territorial behavior, the whole accumulated architecture of millions of years of evolved self-preservation. You could point a living ecosystem at a target and have it attack that target until either the target or the ecosystem was exhausted. The territorial authority had banned research in this area 17 years ago, after a colony world in Sector 3 had experienced a cascade event, trace compound dispersal into a watershed that fed into a regional ecosystem, that produced a behavioral collapse across approximately 80,000 square kilometers. The animals in that zone had not attacked each other and the human population in an organized way. They had attacked everything, randomly, until they died. 60,000 people in the settlement zone had died in the 14 days before the outbreak corridor was sealed. Andrews knew about Sector 3. He considered it a consequence of inadequate dosing protocols rather than a fundamental flaw in the approach. He had notes on it. He had incorporated lessons from it into his synthesis methodology. This is the kind of thing that tells you everything you need to know about a person. Ramada told me he had tried to reach Survey Command directly, through the communication protocols he'd been given when he began working as a registered local contractor. He had been intercepted by Andrews' men, who had apparently been monitoring contractor communication channels. He had tried to reach the firebase indirectly through the Mahura settlement's relay equipment, older technology, different spectrum, and had encountered jamming that he now believed Andrews was producing deliberately to maintain information isolation around the operational area. He had been kept under effective house arrest in the settlement for 3 weeks, allowed to move within it but not beyond its perimeter, while he figured out how to maneuver around a situation that had no clean solution visible from where he was standing. When he heard I had gone to the canyon and come back, he had made the decision to talk. He said he'd been watching me for 3 hours before approaching, which I found slightly unsettling and also professionally understandable. I sat with what he'd told me for about 90 seconds, which is approximately how long I allow myself to be overtaken by the scope of what I'm facing before I begin working the problem. This is not a method I would recommend to everyone. Some situations genuinely benefit from extended processing time. But in my experience, extended processing in a time-sensitive operational environment mostly produces more elaborate versions of the same few conclusions you arrived at in the first 90 seconds, with the addition of anxiety, and anxiety is a lousy planning tool. The problems in order of criticality. Andrews had to be stopped and his operations neutralized. His compound stores had to be secured and destroyed before he could deploy them at scale, and deployment at scale in this watershed meant a Sector 3 analog in a corridor that included the Mahura settlement, Firebase Tamba, and the edge of what my sensor logs already told me was a compromised 30-kilometer radius. The man-ape had to be resolved, not contained, not deterred, but genuinely finished, because something that size carrying that neurochemical load in an ecosystem already showing trace-level contamination was a cascade event waiting for the right conditions. And I had to accomplish all of this with approximately the resources I had started with that morning. Myself, Tamba, a sidearm with 1 1/3 magazines remaining, and whatever the Mahura settlement could contribute. What the Mahura settlement could contribute was, it turned out, more than I'd expected. Ramada knew the canyon's eastern approach in detail, the facility's location, its structural layout, the patrol patterns of Andrews' contractors, the placement of the compound storage units. This was the core intelligence problem solved. Without him, I would have been operating blind on terrain the enemy had occupied for 3 months. With him, I had a map. Shari was the second asset, and I want to be careful about how I describe her because this account will be read by people who weren't there, and who may have the kind of ingrained assumptions about contribution and capability that long experience in field environments tends to dissolve. Shari had grown up in proximity to the canyon. She had explored it as a child, before the man-ape had made the interior untenable. She knew the eastern approach's geography in a way that Ramada did not from a contractor's working knowledge of getting equipment in and out, but from the kind of intimate familial knowledge that comes from a childhood spent in a place. She knew ledge paths that weren't on any survey map. She knew where the canyon wall was weakest and where it was sound. She had also, in the 3 weeks of her husband's effective house arrest, been paying close attention to Andrew's operation in ways that Andrew's people had not noticed, because they had made assumptions about her that the record will indicate were incorrect. Elder Achimd was the third asset. He had served in his youth as a territorial ranger for the settlement, a role that in the Mahura cultural structure combined the functions of scout, perimeter guard, and community arbiter. He was 70-something years old. He moved carefully, and he knew how to use a directed energy projector that the settlement had acquired through a trade 3 years earlier, and that was logged in the base inventory as unaccounted for. I did not ask about the chain of custody. I asked about his proficiency with it, and he demonstrated it on a piece of dead wood at 15 meters, and his proficiency was adequate. Tamba's contribution I will address separately, because it deserves its own treatment. The plan had 3 concurrent components. First, I would enter the canyon from the western approach and move through the main corridor, making enough noise and tactical presence to keep the man-ape oriented toward the west end. Not to fight it, I had already demonstrated the limits of fighting it, and 9 rounds would not improve on 3, but to keep it focused away from the east, where the second component was running. Second, Ramada, Achimd, and Shari would move on the facility from the eastern approach, get inside, neutralize Andrew's people, and destroy the compound stores. The timing required that they be inside and working before I drew the man-ape's attention, which required that my western entry be delayed by a specific interval after they set out. Third, whatever the situation was when those 2 components resolved, we would deal with it then, because the variables were too uncertain to plan a 3rd component in detail. And a detailed plan for uncertain variables is mostly a way of giving yourself something reassuring to believe that will then fail. I have described this plan to people subsequently, and they have generally noted that it depends heavily on the first component, keeping the man-ape occupied for long enough for the second component to complete, and that keeping something like the man-ape occupied is not a controllable variable. This observation is correct. I did not have a controllable alternative. Tamba had her own plan. I did not know this until it was underway. What I knew, as I was waiting at the western canyon mouth in the last light of the day, was that Tamba had been absent for about 3 hours in the afternoon. And when she came back, she was in a state I can only describe as purposeful in a way that exceeded the normal baseline. She was keyed up but not anxious. She was attending to something in a direction I couldn't identify. She sat next to me while I ran through final checks on my equipment, and at one point she put her hand on my forearm and held it there for about 5 seconds, which was the signal she used when she wanted me to know something she didn't have the vocabulary to specify. Then she left in the direction of the canyon's northern ridge. What she was doing, she had located 6 other chimpanzees in the surrounding jungle. Whether she had recruited them from a wild group that ranged in the area, or whether some of them were animals that had been partially habituated to human presence through previous contact with the base, I was never able to determine precisely. What I know is that she had communicated something to them, through vocalizations and gesture signals that the behavioral research unit later described as exceeding what documented chimpanzee communication systems should be capable of, which is the kind of sentence that says more about the limits of our documentation than about the limits of the animals, and that when she moved on Andrew's facility from the North Ridge, they came with her. I entered the Western Canyon approach at dusk. The canyon at night is a different place than the canyon in daylight. The acoustics that make distance judgment unreliable in daylight become something worse in darkness. Sounds arrive from multiple directions simultaneously. Your brain's ability to model the space breaks down almost completely, and the compound smell that permeated the lower canyon had intensified with the cooling air in a way that made my eyes water and my hands less precise than I needed them to be. I moved by memory and by the watercourse channel, staying low, using the walls as a spatial reference. 200 meters in, 300. Tamba's first alarm signal reached me at the 400-meter mark. It was directional. She was above me on the north ridge, and she was indicating a threat at my elevation, ahead and slightly left. I stopped. I controlled my breathing. I waited. The man-ape had positioned itself. Not behind me, not overhead as it had been in the first encounter. It had used a spur of rock formation on the canyon floor as cover, and it was waiting at what I estimated to be the midpoint of the main corridor, where the passage narrowed between two outcropping walls, and any movement through the center would pass within close range of the covered position. This was not the behavior of an animal acting on compound-driven instinct. An animal acting on instinct does not select a choke point. It pursues. This was the behavior of something that had learned from the first encounter. I had time to understand this, and then it came out of cover. I ran. I will not dress up the next 4 minutes. I ran through a canyon in the dark with a 2.5-meter organism behind me that knew the terrain better than I did, had better senses than I did in those conditions, and was not going to stop because I asked it to. I ran and I made choices, left at the split channel, over the dry falls where the watercourse dropped 2 meters, and I hit the rock bed wrong and felt something go in my left ankle that was going to matter later. And the canyon wall came up faster than I'd expected where the corridor bent east, and I used the impact to kill my momentum and turn, and it was there. 4 meters, less than 4 meters. I had 1 magazine and 1 round short of a second, and I used 6 of those rounds in the next 40 seconds. Into the chest, twice. Into the right shoulder. Into the left knee again, same placement as in the first encounter, targeting joint disruption because center mass was demonstrably insufficient against that level of mass and compound suppressed pain response. Once into the neck, which produced the most significant behavioral effect, a full 2-second pause oriented skyward, an involuntary response that I had not anticipated and cannot fully explain. Into the ground in front of it, once, because the muzzle flash and the acoustic shock of the near impact bought me another step of distance at a moment when another step was what I needed. Tamba's signal came from above and to the north, east-leaning, fast, the signal she used when she was indicating movement toward the objective rather than away from it. The compound assault on Andrew's facility had begun. The man-ape heard it. In the dark canyon, with the acoustic bounce of those walls, the sound of 6 chimpanzees and 1 extremely motivated trained intelligence operator hitting a field laboratory was not subtle. The man-ape turned its attention toward the east. It turned its head, then its shoulders, then its full body, and it stood there for 3 seconds that I used to move to the canyon wall and find the ledge path that Shari had described, too narrow for something that broad to follow at speed, 4 meters off the canyon floor, sloping toward the east approach over about 300 meters of traversable rock. I moved along the ledge. Below me, in the dark of the canyon floor, I could hear it tracking. It was not fast on the canyon floor at the pace I was making on the ledge path, and the knee damage from 6 rounds of accumulated impact was in the calculation now, visible in the sound of its movement. I did not stop to appreciate this. I moved. Andrew's facility was burning when I came down the eastern slope. Not catastrophically. The primate troop had overturned equipment, shattered sample storage containers, and disrupted power to the environmental seals that kept the more volatile compound elements contained, and the resulting chemical reaction was producing smoke and a sullen orange light rather than an inferno. But the smoke was thick enough to reduce visibility to about 4 meters and to make breathing uncomfortable, and the light it cast was the kind of light that deceives rather than illuminates, throwing contradictory shadows off the canyon walls. Andrew's contractors had come out of the facility, all 6 of them, some with weapons, some without, all of them having been in a small enclosed space with 6 agitated chimpanzees for the previous several minutes, which is an experience that tends to disorganize tactical thinking regardless of your training level. They were consolidating in the open ground outside the east entrance, trying to account for each other, trying to figure out what the threat axis was. Ramada and Achumd had been waiting in the scrub 40 meters out from the east entrance for 11 minutes, counting from my signal. When the contractors came out and began consolidating, they had them in a 3-way problem. Andrew's people facing north toward the facility exit, us coming from the east, the smoke and sound confusion of Tamba's operation continuing from the north. In a clean engagement, 6 contractors against 3 of us with limited equipment would have been a difficult outcome to predict. It was not a clean engagement. Achum's directed energy projector, at the range we were working, was significantly more effective than its specifications suggested. Ramada moved with the kind of focused economy of a man who has been sitting with rage for 3 weeks and has finally found the appropriate outlet for it. We had 3 contractors disarmed and seated before the other 3 understood the full geometry of the situation. The other 3 made the calculation that people in that situation generally make when the arithmetic is clear. They put down what they were holding and sat down. One of them tried to argue briefly, and Ramada ended the argument with a precision that I noted and did not comment on. Andrews came out through the east entrance with his hands up and one sleeve of his laboratory coat on fire, a small fire, more smoke than flame, that he was managing with the distracted preoccupation of a man whose primary attention is elsewhere. He looked at me. He looked at the seated contractors. He looked at the burning facility behind him. He sat down without being instructed to do so. I found Shari inside. She had gone into the facility ahead of the primate assault. I had not known she was going to do this. I had not specifically told her not to, because it had not occurred to me that it required saying, which is a planning failure on my part that I will own. She had identified, from what Ramada had described to her over 8 months of conversations, the primary dispersal mechanism, a modified atmospheric seeder designed to put Andrew's compound into the wind over a 40-kilometer radius on command. She had located it in the facility's eastern corridor before the primate assault began. She had disabled it by removing its power coupling with a small cutting tool she had brought from the settlement, and she was kneeling beside it in the dark corridor with the smoke coming in from the west section and the orange light from the burning storage tanks painting the walls, and she was entirely calm. I said something to her, I don't remember the words, something adequate to what she had done. The man-ape came through the eastern entrance 3 minutes later. Andrew's contractors scattered the moment it came through the opening. I don't blame them. It came through at a momentum that reduced the entrance frame to a study in structural failure, and the image of it in the smoke-filtered orange light of the burning facility was not an image that encouraged strategic calm. Achum discharged his directed energy projector at 6 meters, full capacity, and the man-ape absorbed it and kept moving with the kind of continuity that tells you something fundamental about the difference between pain response and structural failure. Ramada put himself in front of Shari. The man-ape swept him aside with one arm, and the sound of that impact told me everything I needed to know about the ribs. I had 9 rounds left. I have thought about this moment more than almost any other moment in my professional life, and not because it was the worst moment in terms of pure danger. I have been in situations with worse numbers and less time. I think about it because of what I had to understand in it, and because what I had to understand was something that doesn't fit neatly into any operational framework I've ever been given. The man-ape was not malicious. I want to be specific about this. It was an organism that had been modified by a human being against its nature and without its consent into something that served a human purpose. Its behavior, the relentlessness, the overriding of self-preservation logic, the fixed targeting that had shifted from Shari when she moved and was now oriented toward me, was not its behavior. It was Andrew's behavior, installed by chemistry and running on borrowed machinery. Whatever this creature had been before 11 weeks of Andrew's procedures, what it was now was a casualty. The first casualty of this operation. Still moving, still dangerous, still representing a specific lethal problem that I had a specific professional obligation to resolve, but a casualty. I understand that this observation is not operationally relevant in the moment. I'm making it here because the record should contain it. Andrew's facility was burning more seriously by this point. The primate assault had done thoroughgoing work on the compound storage tanks, and the reaction was proceeding at its own pace, producing a heat that I could feel through the soles of my boots on the rock floor. The chemical smoke was irritating at concentration. My eyes were streaming. My throat was tight. The man-ape appeared largely unaffected, which is what the compound's pain and discomfort suppression does in a high-exposure subject. What I had was the facility itself. I had the smoke and the heat and the fractured storage tanks and the burning compound residue and the structural compromises that the primate assault had introduced to the north section of the facility, and I had a working knowledge of where the most advanced thermal damage was concentrated. And I had Tamba, who had come back from the north entrance through the smoke and had found me in the dark the way she always found me, fast, certain. Her hand on my forearm in the signal she used when she was ready and waiting for direction. I told her to take Shari and go east through the exit corridor. I told her this in the combination of hand signals and vocalized commands that we had been using together for 3 years, and she understood it on the first pass. She went to Shari. Shari, to her considerable credit, looked at me for 1 second and then went. Ramada, moving through cracked ribs with the kind of focused expression that tells you a person has decided pain is a secondary consideration, went with them. I went back into the facility, into the western section, where the burning was most advanced, where the heat pressed through the air, and the smoke had reduced visibility to almost nothing, where the compound reaction in the storage section was producing a structural stress on the exterior wall that I could feel in the floor beneath my feet. A vibration that wasn't mechanical, that was the deep cellular complaint of material about to fail. I moved to the farthest interior corner with a clear sightline to the main corridor, and I waited. The man-ape came. It followed the signal. The compound's chemical trigger pointed it toward Shari, and Shari was gone, so in the absence of the primary target it oriented toward the next available stimulus, which was me. And it came through the facility's interior doorway and came down the main corridor with the compound's logic driving it forward. I used the last 9 rounds deliberately, one at a time. Not to stop it, I had stopped expecting 9 rounds to stop it, but to move it. To use the impact and the pain response, however attenuated, to steer it, east of center, a step to the left, another step. The knee damage compounding with each impact, the gait changing, the forward momentum slowing to something I could stay ahead of by the narrowest margin the situation permitted, moving it toward the exterior wall of the storage section, toward where the wall was going to fail. I was 15 meters from the north exit when the storage tank behind the exterior wall lost containment. It was not an explosion. It was a rapid structural failure. A wall panel separating from its compromised frame and falling outward, and with it, the accumulated thermal damage and the burning compound residue, and the chemical heat of everything Andrews had built in this place going outward into the open air of the canyon, taking with it whatever was between that wall and the open air at the moment of failure. I was through the north exit by the time it failed. I had the timing right by approximately 4 seconds, which is a margin I will not pretend was entirely the product of planning. I came through the north exit and I hit the ground outside, and I lay on the rock, and I breathed the clean air, and I looked up at the sky, and I thought nothing at all. Just breathing. Just the stars and the smoke drifting east on the canyon wind, and the fatting sound of the facility's continued combustion. I gave myself 30 seconds of that. Then I got up and went to find the people I was responsible for. Tamba found me first, as she generally did. She came down the North Canyon wall at a pace that suggested she had been watching the exit and waiting, and she covered the distance between us fast and put her hands on my face, and was still for a moment while she ran her assessment. Satisfied. She sat on my foot, which was her way of indicating that she was not going anywhere, and neither was I for a specified period, and I stood there and let the shaking in my hands run through and dissipate. Ramada had 2 broken ribs and a cracked collarbone. He was sitting upright when I found him, breathing carefully, holding himself in the way of a man who has learned from experience the exact posture that produces the least cost. He recovered fully. Shari was uninjured. Achimd had a burn on his forearm from his projector's heat exhaust that would leave a scar and would heal cleanly. Of Andrew's 6 contractors, all were detained and transported. Andrews himself sat in the open ground east of the facility for the remainder of the night and did not speak, and did not ask for medical attention, and did not try to argue about what had happened. I don't know what he was processing. I didn't ask. The facility burned itself out over the next 4 hours. The canyon wind carried the smoke south and east, away from the settlement and the base. By the time the sector command response team arrived, 14 hours after I activated the emergency beacon, which was 14 hours of managing 6 detained contractors, and 1 very quiet scientist with inadequate rations, and a sprained ankle that had developed some opinions of its own. There was very little of the facility left to examine. The Behavioral Research Unit spent 3 weeks in the canyon afterward. The xenochemistry team spent longer. I wrote my 68-page incident report over 2 weeks, which is a length I consider appropriate given the scope of what it was covering. The court-martial proceedings against Andrews and his principal contractors ran for 4 months, and concluded with outcomes that I was informed of officially and considered broadly proportionate. Mahura's settlement held a ceremony 17 days after the operation. I attended because Mahura had asked me to attend, and because I felt the obligation. The ceremony was for the canyon, not for the resolution of the threat exactly, but for the canyon itself, acknowledging that it had been a site of significant harm and asking it, in the formal idiom of Mahura's culture, to return to what it had been. I don't know the theology behind that request. I know that I sat in the settlements gathering ground and watched Mahura perform the ceremony, and felt something that I couldn't have put clean words to at the time, and can only approximate now, years later, as a kind of gratitude. Tamba attended also. She was treated, by the settlement's elders, with a formal respect that I noted with deep satisfaction. The settlement's hunters had spent the previous week documenting evidence that the canyon's compound contamination was dispersing. The animals near the perimeter returning to normal behavioral parameters, the crocodiles back in the river, the avian predators restored to their natural ranges. The jungle, slowly and without any acknowledgement that anything had changed, was going back to what it was. I've thought about Andrews many times since then. He's a specific type of human problem, the kind with a mind capable of extraordinary things, and an ethical blind spot so total that it functions not as a gap in his reasoning, but as an alternative framework. He genuinely believed that what he was doing was legitimate research with legitimate applications. He genuinely believed that the ban on limbic override research was short-sighted policy produced by frightened administrators reacting to a single incident. He had notes on Sector 3. He had incorporated those notes. He considered himself to have solved the problem that Sector 3 represented, and what had happened in that canyon as a consequence of his solution was, in his framework, a developmental setback rather than a human and moral catastrophe. I am not telling you this to suggest sympathy for him. I am telling you this because it's the truth, and because understanding what Andrews was is relevant to understanding what we're actually dealing with out here on the fringe. He is not an anomaly. He is a type. And the thing that type produces, when it operates without oversight in environments where the consequences of its work fall primarily on beings that don't have seats at the administrative table, the compound in the watershed, the animal that charged a child, the man-ape wired to a purpose it was never meant to serve, those consequences are the fringe's specific recurring problem. The Wazuli have been doing what Andrews was trying to do for longer than humanity has been in space. I have read the intelligence summaries. I have seen the effect mapping on worlds in their absorption corridor. Their methodology is different in its biochemistry and similar in its logic. Find the leverage point in the local biology, apply the signal, watch the behavior change, advance. They look at the fringe worlds and they see territories to be metabolized, and they approach resistance the way Andrews approached the canyon's ecology, as a technical problem with a technical solution. What they keep underestimating is what I watched happen in the dark outside that facility. Tamba did not follow orders. I had not told her to assemble a troop, to coordinate with Ramada's timeline, to come back for me through the north exit. She had made assessments and acted on them, because she had worked alongside humans long enough to understand something fundamental about how humans approach the problem of overwhelming force. You do not assess it and conclude it cannot be overcome. You find the angle. You wait for the moment. You use what is available in the combination that the moment allows, without waiting for a situation that gives you everything you need before you act. You do not let the scale of the opposition become a reason to stand still. Mahura had told me something the morning before I went into the canyon, at the edge of his settlement with both of us looking at the tree line. He said it in his language first, and then translated it, which he didn't always do. He chose translation when he meant the thing to be carried beyond the conversation. He said, "The canyon is not dangerous because of what lives in it. It is dangerous because of what it teaches those who enter it about what they are capable of." He was right, he usually was. I kept the medal. I don't wear it, but I kept it because it stands for something that I find worth keeping track of, not the valor the colonel cited, not the perimeter preservation, not the institutional language that medals speak. Something smaller and harder than that. The fact that when something built for killing and carrying someone else's agenda came through a doorway and came for what I was responsible for, I did not wait for better odds. I stood in the smoke with what I had, and I did what needed doing. Not because I calculated that I could, not because the odds were favorable. Because there was no one else. That's the whole of it. The jungle has been quiet for a long time now. The canyon is just a canyon again. Tamba is asleep in the chair beside my bunk as I write this final line. She decided some months ago that this was her preferred sleeping arrangement, and she has never asked my opinion on the matter, and I find that I don't have one. Outside the river runs. The crocodiles are where they belong. Some days that is enough.